So, William, thanks for joining us on the DANcast today. Appreciate you being here, and looking forward to talking to you and getting some insight about what you do in the industry and your background and maybe some diving. I think people know you for the Scuba Diving the Industry Magazine that you recently started a couple years ago, but you've long been a numbers guy. I mean, you've been crunching the numbers in the industry
Yeah.
long time, right? You go way back. Maybe you could give us a little bit of history about your beginnings.
So in 1990, I moved from Fort Lauderdale to Texas at the invitation of my brother-in-law that had a software company. And he said, we need someone that knows marketing. And you kind of have done this in your world. I said, yeah, but I don't never done anything in software. He says, hey, the principles are the same. He says, why don't you come to Dallas and try it for a few months and see if you become our in-house marketing guy for this software company. So I thought, well, it was work for somebody else or kind of do something on my own. They offered me a little partnership. So I said, sure. So I came to Dallas and started in the software world thinking I'd had great experiences in diving. I'd been diving all my life in one sense or another. I thought maybe it was time to move on to a real career. And so I got a call from a guy named Harry Averill, which I'd worked with at Pro Dive back in the 80s. And he said, hey, I'm doing this magazine for DEMA called Selling Scuba. And he said, I need someone that can help me work the booth and hand out free subscriptions. Would you come to DEMA? And I said, well, yeah, but I can't afford to fly to DEMA. He said, no, DEMA will pay for you to go. And they said, we won't pay you anything, but we'll just pay your expenses to go, and you can work the booth, you can hand out subscriptions. So I got to the show, and I had no idea that I would be drugged back into the industry. And I'm handing out subscriptions, and this woman walked up by the name of Laura Donaghy. And she had a badge on from Rodale Press. And I said, Rodale Press, don't you guys do because my mom read Prevention Magazine. I said, yeah, Prevention. She says, yeah, we do Runner's World and Men's Health and some others. And I said, well, what's a big publisher doing walking around the show here at DEMA? She says, well, I'm actually here to collect information on the industry. We're thinking about maybe doing something in this space at some point. And I said, well, I have a little bit of information in my office back home. I can send you just stuff that I learned when I went through my course director training years ago. I said, but I know the guy that knows everything you're going to want to know. And I said, his name's Bob Gray. He runs the whole show. So I said, I told Harry I'd take a quick break and walked her up to the executive offices they had at the show there. And I walked in, and this is nothing bad against any of these people I mentioned, but it's funny how things happen in life. I said, Bob, do you have a few minutes I want to talk to you about? William, I don't have any time. I'm late for a meeting. Talk to me later. And walks right by me and this woman, Laura. I looked at her and I said, I'm so sorry. I said, he's a busy guy. I said, but Marion Rivman, the PR firm, is right directly next door in the next office. I said, she'll have everything you need as well. I said, and so let's walk over. So, of course, that was the meeting he was rushing out to, was to go meet her. So the same exact thing happened. William, I don't have time to talk to you. So I turned embarrassed and I said, look, here's my card. When I get back to Dallas, I'll send you what I have. And so she says, well, she said, can we give you our FedEx number and just send whatever you have about the diving industry? So I cobbled together stuff that was available from having worked at Pro Dive and stuff that we just generally have. I think DEMA's Blueprint for Growth was available back then, and I found a copy of that, and I sent it to FedEx, and I get a phone call the next day from a guy named Chuck McCullough, which was the senior vice president of the sporting division of Rodale Press, and he said, we really appreciate all your information. And Laura, said you guys met this weekend at the DEMA Show. And he said, would you come out to Emmaus? We'd like to talk to you about the diving space. We really think this could be something we want to do. And I said, okay. I said, but I can't afford to fly there. I mean, it's really, truly rubbing two sticks together, starting this little venture in the software world. And they said, oh, no, we'll FedEx you a ticket. Back then we had tickets, So they FedExed a ticket to me, and they sent a driver to pick me up at the little tiny airport in Allentown, Allentown, I think is where they flew me into. Anyhow, we went to their offices, and he said, we had a whole day together. And he said, at the end of the day, he says, I have a bunch of needs and information I need, requirements and research and stuff on the industry. And so we ended up coming up with a list of 25 questions that he wanted answered. He says, so you go back to Dallas, think about how much you'll charge me to come up with those answers. He says, we really don't know anybody else in the industry that we can work with that kind of is not really known. Turns out they liked me because I was unknown in the industry, but I had some information at my fingertips. So my dad was working at the time. He said, Dad, I don't know how much to charge these people. He says, well, whatever you're thinking, double it. So I did. And so I sent a fax back then back to the guy. He signed the contract, no problem. He said, and gave me kind of an open paycheck to just as many hours as needed to accomplish these goals. So we did a bunch of different things. We started with research because there wasn't much back then. So we did a couple of retailer studies. We asked some various questions. If Dan and Patty were to let a new magazine have access to their subscribers, would that matter to you, right? Very pointed questions, but there was a method to the whole methodology, because I said, well, the two biggest lists in the industry at the time were three. There's three out there. One is Patty, two is Dan, the third is all the resorts in the world, because they have to collect liability releases that has a customer's name and address on it, the divers. And he said, well, the third one's a little harder to come by, but I said the first two are, they're just one phone call, one person. And so we did this study. We did a few other things in the industry. One of the things they wanted to understand was the certification process. Was there barriers to growth? So we did a survey of 300 people in the first night of their open water course. And back then we mailed an envelope to the dive shop, and we had 78 dive shops that participated. They sent the envelopes back. And the reason we did the first night was they were divers, but they didn't know anything about diving.
Yeah.
So they had committed to become a diver, but they didn't know brands, they didn't know anything. So we've collected a lot of really interesting information, like how many dive shops they visited before they chose the one they did, and it was an average of like 1.2 shops. In other words, they just went to wherever there was somebody in their neighborhood is where they got certified. So the next thing we did is we did two different programs. We reached out to Dr. Peter Bennett, and we had a meeting arranged a meeting and flew to your beautiful offices up there and met with him, and we said we'd like to do a deal, to get access to your list to launch this new magazine that they want to do. They were known back then for the editorial integrity, so they didn't do pay-per-play. There was no, if you paid an ad, you get an article, none of that stuff. They were very objective in their editorial side, and that was going to be kind of counter back then to the skin diver days, which was very effective, but it was a different model. So we presented the report to Peter showing that these shops that were Dan members at the time, it was like 78%, so they didn't care. It was fine, as long as the editorial was clean and it was good and it was, objective. And then we made another trip a few days later and met with John Cronin out at Patty. And we did the same thing. Are you interested in doing a list? No, we don't do a list. Our members would never go for that. And so we, the old-fashioned day, slapped the report on the desk, and he goes, where'd you get this? I said, well, we surveyed, I think it was 180 Patty dive stores in the country, and the owner said, again, 78, 80% said, we don't care. It sounds great. We could use another magazine kind of thing. So that gave them access to two very important lists at the very beginning of this process. And then the third was the resorts. And I said, well, you need advertisers to launch a magazine. So this is not my first foray, as I'm getting at. This is in 1990 when all this happened. And I said, but every resort every dive shop has to keep these liability forms. And back then, electronic lists were just kind of coming to be, but nobody really knew what to do with them, because how do you get them from, handwritten notes to actual list that you could mail to? So I said, well, why don't we do a program where we give them, I think it was 10 cents per name. 10 cents for valid valid mailing address and name. We'll give them a 10-cent credit towards an ad. So guys like John Englander sent us 50,000 records. We had Ron Kipp send us 25,000 records. I said, no, it's going to cost a little because we've got to pay for shipping. And it turned out that we didn't have to just pay for shipping. We had to have a warehouse in Dallas where all these records went to and had to be fumigated because they came from all over the world. And there was roaches in them and everything else, right? So they had to be fumigated. And then we hired a firm that's all they did was do data entry. And so they ended up launching their first issue with 130 pages, 140 pages, 78 advertisers. It was the most successful launch. And of course, a lot of these advertisers had multiple issues of credit. So they did full page ads. It didn't cost them anything. And they got the list back electronically on a floppy disk back then,
Sure.
So that kind of was my start in the industry, you might say, from a marketing side of things. I'd always been kind of on the training before. And the very next project that happened after the magazine, by the way, was Scuba Diving Magazine. And we actually did a focus group to try to find the best name for a new magazine, and that tested, of course, better than all of them. And it was I was reading a great book at the time called Battle for the Mind by Jack Rise and Al Trout, and it's about an 80-page book is all it is, but it's positioning Battle for the Mind, and they're marketers, consultants to Coca-Cola and some of the bigger companies, and they were talking about how that the ideals, if you can create a product or a brand name that is as close to the generic as possible, the Kleenex, the Xerox, and so on. And a lot of analogies say, well, what's the name of our sport that used to be called skin diving? Now it's called scuba diving. So of course that tested out fantastic. But and then my job was basically over when they printed that first issue. So now had made a few dollars and had a staff in my office. I hired some people, ex-people from Patty. I hired the guy, Harry Averill, a few people like that to work on this project, but it was over. And I got a call not 2 or 3 weeks later from John Englander, and he was president of the Bahamas Diving Association. They had a marketing committee. They said, we're looking for an agency to take over and help with our dive marketing. Would you be willing to come and compete for it? So fast forward 10 years, I ended up having probably a dozen tourism boards that I've done that same work for. Most recently, Bahamas ended my contract finally in 2020, but it was 30 years, so I couldn't complain. It was a wonderful, wonderful ride with those people, a wonderful contract. So during the early 2000s, we kept running into this problem. There was no research. There was independent research, and we had done a lot of our own individual research. And the reason we did it was because, just like Rodale, I'd get hired by a client to try to solve a problem, whether it be a tourist board or resort or manufacturer, and there was no data, so we have to go collect this data ourselves. And I had a friend of mine I was working with that was a teacher at the University of Baltimore and a statistician. I said, is there a way we can construct a survey, simple survey, that we could send out to the industry and kind of find out how they did last quarter, and just 1 quarter forecast, not trying anything great, just the next quarter. So we came up with this 5-6 question survey that's been done for 24 years, and we have emailed it around the world, and the list is over 17,000 that get this survey. And it's really the only independent kind of guidestone for our industry to see how we are doing and how we've been performing. 13 years ago, I was gracious enough to be voted on the board of directors for DEMA, and the very first thing Tom did was task me to be the research committee chair, which I have been for 13 years. And the very first thing we did is start doing surveys like crazy. So now there's not as much of a vacuum of data out there as there used to be. DEMA's done some amazing studies. One of my first big research clients was Dan. I actually did your first customer surveys way back when in the Chris Wackold stage. You know?
Yep, I think I've seen this. Yep.
So now there's a lot of great stuff out there. It's not such a problem. When fast forward to COVID, COVID came, and I still do the survey, I do it every quarter. COVID came, and unfortunately, Mark Young, great pioneer in our industry, had a fabulous set of magazines called Dive Training and Dive Center Business Magazine, and he had published for almost the same amount of years as Scuba Diving at that point. I think that maybe he started it a month or two before even then. And COVID killed a lot of things in our industry, and that unfortunately was one of the results of the COVID time. So for the last 5 years, we've had no way to talk to the industry, no way to reach dive shops. And again, client need. I had clients that needed to be able to say what's going on. We want to talk to them. You can't mail 30 different pieces of brochures to a dive shop. It just makes it impossible. So in 2023, I came up with an idea that there was no list out there. Nobody had done anything in the retail space for a long time. So I set out to create a system that we could try to find every brick and mortar dive shop left in the United States. And the tools that we had available in 2023 didn't exist 10 years ago. For instance, Google Street View is a relatively new concept. And not new, but now it's everywhere, and it works even in foreign countries and so on. Right. So we started with the internet, and we Googled dive shops in Texas, classic or dive. We had a couple different key terms we used. And we had thousands and thousands of hits. We had, independent instructors and boat docks and everything else. So we would filter it down to, okay, do they have a website? Well, that was one check at least. And that kind of separated all the others for the most part. And then we'd go through, okay, well, can we find a picture of their dive shop, either from the front of their shop in their website or the inside store? And that if we could find that was helpful. But then we went to Google Street, and if we could not physically see them on Google Street, they went into a different pile. Didn't mean they weren't a shop, because it's not perfect, and there are some weird ones, like in the Midwest. in the north, especially where you don't have a lot of diving, because of the seasonality, people converted garages to dive shops.
Right.
It just didn't show up in Google Street, but it had a shop and they had a real, and so we had to put them through a different layer of investigation. Thirdly, they had to be able to sell. They had to sell. They had to offer instruction. They had to have equipment sales. Those are the two things besides having a physical store, because we have hybrid stores out there that are like, well, Divers Direct, not so much, but Divers Direct's a classic example. Some of their stores don't do instruction. They're just retail only.
Right, retail.
We don't qualify them as and I probably mistake, but we don't put them on our list as, we only send our magazine to the one that does the training. Because if you're a manufacturer or you're a resort out there and you really want to reach the people that are truly the traditional dive shop, that's where that circulation list came from. So we still do all the marketing, we still do the research and all that, but the passion for the last 3.5 decades has really poured into this Scuba Diving Industry Magazine. It's been great.
Yeah, and it really comes through. I know there's a lot of work and the progress that you've made. Yeah, tell me a little bit about that. I mean, you've been in this industry for so long. Like, how has it changed? Like, what are a couple things that maybe stand out to you that are significantly different than they used to be when you were talking about the 90s?
You know, it's a rare you find an industry where someone can make an entire life of that industry and have an incredible excitement and enjoyment. And for the most part, you know, if we make a mistake in this industry, with the rare exception of training, if we make a mistake in this industry, someone doesn't usually die, like in the hospital or in other professions of work, you know, or as an airline pilot. So then generally we have a really easy, fun industry, and we deal with customers that are having fun. That's all our industry is about, is having fun, right? Because that's what the sport is. So I think that's a really fortunate aspect of diving, and anybody that's in this sport that can stay in it long term and figure out a way to make a living in it, you know, good for you, because there's so many friends of yours and mine that, you know, hate their jobs, hate their careers, and they only go diving for the vacation. You know, we get to live it 365. I think the biggest trend that I think is affecting our industry is Mark Young had said for many years that he felt like that the resort certification programs were not necessarily healthy for our industry. But there wasn't a lot of real black and white data to back it up. There was some. So in 2019, DEMA did a study that they did a consumer study, and we asked a variety of questions like that. How did you get certified? What was the process? What was the timeline? We looked at things like what time from the time they went to their first shop to the actual time they signed up for a shop, what was those timelines like? We looked at, did they do it all at that class or do it at the shop, or they only start there, or they do the pool there? I mean, all the different elements. There's never been really queried in a survey like that. So, you know, kudos to the DEMA board for wanting to dive into this area that could possibly be somewhat controversial. And they found black and white proof, and there's absolute evidence that if a consumer starts at a local dive shop, it doesn't matter whether they finish there. Even if they just walk in the door and sign up for classes there and do just their pool work at that shop, or even just sign up literally, the data shows very clearly that they have a much higher affinity to staying in the sport, buying more dive gear, and traveling more often. And diving, just simply being more active in the industry. And it took a couple of more surveys to try, because then we did another question. We did it again in 2022, 23. How many diver friends do you have? Not just within your family, but friend circle. And the reason being is because we're exploring to see the psychological connection a consumer makes with the dive shop is critical, because they're doing this for fun. Mm-hmm. You want to have fun with people, right?
Sure.
But when you go to Hawaii or the Bahamas, which is fantastic programs for people to learn to dive, they're amazing when you go over there and you do the whole thing there. It is a great way. My kids did it that way when I was working with Stuart Cove. I mean, we have friends that have done it. But you have to work extra hard then to connect them to the local shop, because they have no connection. You know, they don't know Rich Thomas International Scuba because they never walked in the door. You know, they also have never bought any gear hardly per se in the industry. So how do you fix this problem? I don't know, Steve. I think it is something that we need to address, something we need to figure out. You can't put the genie back in the bottle. You can't keep people from doing it. But I think we're missing a little bit of an element when someone does go and get their certification in those beautiful, gorgeous destinations. There needs to be a way that we can connect them with the local shop. I don't have the answer. I know there's been a few attempts over the years to try to solve that problem, but to me, that's one of our biggest obstacles moving forward, and probably one of the biggest shifts that we figured out that didn't happen in the 80s when we were having double-digit growth. No one did that. It didn't exist. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of my armchair analysis, and I don't have the answers to it. I just know what the problem is to some degree.
Yeah. Talk to me a little bit about new diver certifications. So you talked about the resort certifications, but that's something every issue that comes out, every survey you do, that's something of particular interest to me and Dan, because it, kind of on the front lines, we're looking to bring people into the safety organization as they become involved with the sport. So we want them learning best practices and all the things they can do to prevent accidents and injuries right out of the gate. So what do you see going on with new diver certs in the industry, and where do you see it kind of going forward?
Well, there's a beautiful side of liability. Beautiful side of liability is that things don't get broken very often. If they're broken, they get fixed. And diver training, since really Dr. Alex Brilski came up with the modular scuba program in 88 or 89 for PADI, and now it's pretty much universal. Everybody does a modular kind of approach. It was groundbreaking. It was unique. And I think that process, and then you add in the American liability situation, and our training is fantastic. I don't care if you're SEI, NAUI, SSI, PADI, all the agencies, especially if they're on their RSTC, the standards are very, very good today. People, I think, are incredibly safe when they're certified. There is a constant need, of course, for additional education. And there is a direct correlation with the more they train, the more gear they buy, and the more they stay in travel. So the smart dive shops want to continue that process, not only for profitability, but it keeps their customers. But I feel today that our divers are, I would never say they're less trained than they were. I think the tools are better. The technology's better. There's all kinds of inventions coming out almost every year in the industry to make it diving safer even. And so I think from a safety standpoint, we are producing really good quality divers. I think that some people have a perception that I think our retail industry is fading. In 2020, Mark Young, again, from Dive Center Business Magazine, which at the time held really, really good records on the number of dive shops in the country, published an article. There were 1,020 shops. Well, we have 966. That's not a very big change. In fact, we might be missing 20 shops, so we might be 980 or 990. So the shops that have survived COVID, have done well. That was probably the biggest, as we all know, challenge to the retailing
for sure.
in general.
Yeah, the industry took a big hit.
Yeah, and a lot of people are still recovering. I just had a conversation with a dive operator, resort operator, I won't say who, but that they made it through COVID. They survived. All their boats are fine, because it was almost like a hurricane, you might say, from a business standpoint. Problem is they're all beat up. Everybody's beat up. The cash reserves are gone. The boat that needed that maintenance or the new engine is going to have to wait a year, And so that, I think, has been the biggest change is we got an industry that's going to take a little bit more time to recover. You just can't put a $300,000 engine in a boat, or a couple engines in a boat and, out of cash flow unless you've got those reserves. So.
Absolutely. How about the travel industry? What are you seeing with the travel trends? Because we know, as you already said, that diving and travel are so closely related. Any thoughts on what we're going to see here in the next quarter or two?
Well, our quarterly surveys show that travel usually is a little more resilient than equipment sales at the retail level, at least. I see that it's on par with what we had last year in 2024. We don't see any big changes in that regard in terms of trends, according to at least our surveys. I do know that it's we've got more dive resorts today, we've got more liveaboards today than we've ever had. I think I did a study for a client I want to say the late 99, 2000s, and I could only find about 300 liveaboards in the world. I updated a different project for another client. I think there's well over 1,000 now. And there might even be 2,000 or 3,000 because the Red Sea alone might have 1,000. I don't know. But because not everybody's easy to find. It's challenging to find them. Yeah. So I think travel, is going to continue to be very resilient in our industry. People want to get away. We're seeing shifts in travel trends, whereas before everybody wanted the long haul, super great 14-day trip with the instability in our economy and so on. I think there's been a lot of studies done that's outside of diving that points that people want to stay a little closer to home, maybe spend a little less, but they're still going to travel.
Yeah, that's very cool. Let's go back just a little bit. So you kind of gave me quite a history of your experience in the industry, which is quite amazing. But you mentioned to me something you're doing that's quite new. So you've actually got a podcast of your own. Tell me what you got going on.
So when we launched the magazine, we wanted a way of connecting the contributors with other people in the industry more than just in print. So we teamed up with Greg Holt over at Scuba Radio, and he co-produces one of our monthly podcasts called Level Up. And it's a pure editorial product. We don't charge anything for it. We don't even have advertisers on it. It's just every writer gets an opportunity to talk about their article a little bit more for about an hour. The whole show is 5 or 10 minutes each author. That's been really successful. It's got people that are, dive instructors that are driving to work will listen to it or watch it, hopefully not in their car, but listen to it. So we've had some good success there. And then a lot of the authors will take those clips. We integrate those clips into the digital version of the magazine, so you can go back and look at, for instance, Dan Orr is almost always on our podcast, and you go to every one of his articles, and the article has his little drop-in of his video that starts playing if you just click on it, so you can listen to him talking more about that article. So it was kind of a way of bringing the industry a little closer to the authors. Then about 2 months ago, my son Britton, which handles our ad sales for us, we started talking, we need a way of which dive companies can talk about what they are, who they are, their products or services, maybe their marketing, maybe their strategies. So Wayne Brown, the CEO of Aggressor, was kind enough to be our first guest on our very first show. And he talked about how that he doesn't use forecasting in his business models, and a little bit about how that they are very conscientious and aware of exchange rates and move money from country to country based to get the most bang out of their marketing dollars, and kind of how they pick their marketing channels. It was really quite interesting. And then we've had Brent Beringhouse from Aqualung talking about his new AquaSense, this new regulator they're trying to come to market with. We've had a bunch of different companies come on and talk about it, about what's going on to them. And that's designed for, in fact, I would say out of the 15 podcasts we've had, we do it every Monday, by the way, at 1 o'clock Central. It's between 5 and 10 minutes long. But of out of the 15, I think we've only had maybe 3 or 4 that are actually advertisers. They're just companies. So kind of like what's your effort here, which I think is just amazing. And our industry needs more of this. This is the kind of communication that we need to have within our industry. And a consumer would find a lot of what you do fascinating as well.
Yeah, thanks. We've been doing this setup for a while now, and I think it's a very genuine conversation. It's just free, it's real, and I think people, they want to hear that, and they want to hear it an authentic message, and I think it really resonates with people. And what we're really trying to do in our marketing campaign is every diver should be a member, and it really kind of brings different peoples and personalities and perspectives together, and there's really something for everybody. So I think it's been very successful for us, and I think you're well on your way too. What as we kind of progress through the year already, what are your predictions for DEMA? We're back in Orlando. Orlando is typically a good location for DEMA. A lot of diving down there. It's easy for the shops to get to. You have any thoughts what we'll see going into DEMA this year?
I do. Everybody's trying to get back to 2021, our pre-COVID years. DEMA didn't have a show in 2020. It was a virtual show. 2021 was a greatly reduced show, partly because the industry was so injured and battered. At 23 and 24, it's just building each year. New Orleans was a really great year. We saw a fantastic recovery there. We had a little bit of down year in Vegas compared to New Orleans, but it was mostly, I think, fueled by the F1 race. People were concerned of hotel rates, and they were concerned of getting around the Strip and doing all the stuff they like to do there, So we're projecting Orlando. It's going to be a really good show. I mean, there's just still no way to communicate with hundreds. I think I did a survey once that showed that 85 to 90% of dive shops go to the DEMA show once every 3 years, at least. A large percentage go every single year. So, you can spend hundreds of thousands of dollars sending reps all around the country on the road to reach these shops, or just go to DEMA for 4 days and exhibit. They're there, So it's not so much, in my mind, a numbers game when it comes to DEMA. And yes, I sit on the board of directors for DEMA, and yes, it's important because, it's all about the association's gotta, be funded and so on. But it's really about the quality of the people. And about 8 years ago, DEMA made a real substantial change to the admission process of how you get into the show. And I applaud them for being tough with the credentialing. It's hard because I've been at the front where I've heard people arguing with the check-in people. Look, I'm a dive instructor. Well, do you have your card? Well, no, I left it at home. So they're really, really strict about the credentialing because you're spending a lot of money to go to that show if you're an exhibitor, and in some cases hundreds of thousands of dollars. You want to make sure that the people that are wandering those aisles are your buyers or are your potential customers. So I think there's still no replacement for the DEMA show. I believe that every company in this industry should exhibit at the DEMA Show, not just some of the board of directors, because I believe that there's no other way to reach those quality people in 4 days like there is at that show.
Yeah, our booth is very busy during DEMA, and we get customers from all over the world, and it's really good to sit down and take some time and explain the new programs and things we have available to keep their divers safer. And it is great to see everyone, too, from a personal note. You know, such a tight-knit industry, and everybody kind of uses that as a gathering point every year.
Absolutely.
So it's a pretty significant event.
You mentioned international, and DEMA has an international committee. They have a committee that's just a bunch of people in our industry, about, I think it's 15 people on that committee, that do nothing but try to solve the problem of bringing more international people into the show. And how do we do it? And the association put into the show. I think Peter Symes from X-Ray Magazine out of Denmark is the chair of that committee. And so, I mean, they really are trying to make it to where it's a show that everybody can come to. You know, unfortunately, it's not an inexpensive show, but part of that is because of the venues we have to put it in. We're big enough that we can't be in a hotel basement. It's got to be in a convention center. Then all of a sudden you go to convention centers, now you've got unions in our country. That's a real strong issue that drives the cost up, unfortunately, of these shows.
Yeah. How about bringing more people to the sport? So you just talked about how do we bring more international people here, but how do we grow the diving business overall? I mean, what's the secret to that, in your opinion?
Well, I think the secret is rooted in the local retailer. I mean, you've got people that, you know, they're in the community. They know the community. I mean, they are the best outreach fingers of our industry. I've heard people talk for years about how we need some giant, you know, marketing campaign for diving. Well, we're never going to compete with skiing in terms of advertising. We're not going to compete with golfing. You know, we just don't have the infrastructure, and I don't see all of the big players in our industry coming together and forking up $100,000 a piece to put a $10 million campaign together, for instance. It's just not going to happen. So I think the growth of our industry is through the grassroots. I think, and the grassroots are the dive shops, the dive retailers. They know how to bring these people in. Tom Leard runs a shop in Muncie, Indiana, called Leard's Underwater Service. And his manager is Brooke Speedy, which they have both written for us and been on our other podcast several times, Level Up, and they're great people. He runs a 7-week open water course. And I had him on, he wrote an article about it. I said, what, 7 weeks? Who's got 7 weeks to get certified? He says, no, you don't understand it. We build this connection with them over that 7 weeks. If someone's willing to spend 7 weeks on a class with us, they're a customer for life. He said, we have an 85% sell-through on continuing education. That's how we grow our industry, is people thinking outside the box. I'm not saying that you have to have a 7-week course. I'm just saying they think outside the box. You got Scuba Schools of America here that is we're in California. They happen to be on Montclair. They do their own giant sale every year where they even have a pool. And they bring people out and do, you know, a portable pool they set up for people to do classes. A very aggressive shop. Warner Kern down in Ocean Enterprises. You know, he runs huge open water classes, a massive travel program. He's very, very involved in the community in San Diego. You know, that's how you grow our industry, is these sharp retailers. Rich Thomas in Dallas at International Scuba. He has 2 shops. He even trademarked the term Dive Tribe, because he figured out that if you keep his customers diving all year long, guess what? They buy gear and they buy travel from him, and education. And his Dive Tribe actually does every single weekend. We have a quarry not too far from us called the Scuba Ranch, and he has a pavilion out there for just his shop. I went out there for one last summer to go to one of his just weekends, and he had 100 people there from his shop, 100 customers. That's how you grow diving.
It's a lot of divers.
It's a lot of divers.
Yeah, it's good to see. This has been a great conversation here, and we can kind of start moving to wrap up. Anything else that you want to cover or talk about that you've got going on that's interesting, or
I think
anything
that,
at all?
You know, and this is not a commercial for Dan, but Dan is so essential to our industry. You know, we don't have anybody out there doing the kind of research you're doing. We don't have anybody out there that's trying to help make diving safer without an ulterior motive because they want to sell a dive computer or whatever. And that's what really Dan accomplishes for our industry. And I mean, I started diving when I was 12 years old and was running a dive shop at 16 in Southern California. You know, I've my life in this industry, and as a professional, you know, I do your insurance, I do your top insurance, your travel insurance, the whole thing every year, and I've done it for years for me and my family because a classic example. A friend of mine, my neighbor, got an ear infection in a remote location in the South Pacific. I won't say which place because I don't want to make him feel bad. But he just burst an eardrum, right? not a big deal. Went to the local clinic. 3.5 weeks later, he was able to fly home finally after moving to 2 different hospitals to get simple antibiotic treatment that was proper for his ear. People don't realize when you are in some of these places that sound so really, really cool and you think they're modern, they don't have the American healthcare system like we do.
We're very spoiled here.
We're very spoiled, and you need that evacuation. You need to be able to get on a plane and come home. I've always said if anything ever happens, we're on a vacation anywhere, use our insurance, get me home. Don't be treated locally if it's if it's not life-threatening. So thank you.
Yep. Well, that's what we're here for. We've been helping divers since 1980, and we'll be helping divers far into the future, we hope. So
thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, William, this has been a great conversation. I hope you have a great rest of your week, and I hope the audience out there listening to this enjoys it as well. But thank you very much.
My pleasure.